Jean Kiesel. I'm the Louisiana Room Librarian at Dupree Library, University of Louisiana at Lafayette. I've been here about, well, almost 30 years now, and a major part of my job is to help people with their research and help answer questions, particularly people who are doing historical research, and many of them are researching family history or their local history. I've had a fair amount of experience in that amount of time. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the collections we have in the library in special collections, perhaps things that are unique to our collection that you won't necessarily find somewhere else. When you're doing your family history, of course, you want to start with your relatives. Start at home and find out what you can from family members about your ancestry, who they were, what their names were, dates if you can find them, or even an approximation, gives you a place to start. Also, if you can get information about where they lived, what they did for a living, anything that would help you flesh out their history and learn more about them. When you come to the library, most of the things we have probably predate 1900, or at least the early 1900s. Most of the records from the later part of the 20th century or more current records are either available online or because of privacy issues, they're not published. So if you can get back to, say, 1940, you can start looking at census records. If you can get before 1900, we probably would have some resources that would help you with your research. Of course, we have the census records for Louisiana, starting with 1805, which was the first one taken after the Louisiana Purchase, and continuing every 10 years through 1930. The 1940 census has also been released, but that's available online through several sites, and so we did not buy the microfilm for that. And of course, there is no census for 1890 because those records were lost. But for the other years, we have a complete set of microfilm for Louisiana, and many of the censuses have also been indexed, and we have those tools available to help you find the records for your ancestors. We also have Father Heber's books. Southwest Louisiana records cover St. Landry Parish, including most of Acadiana. So those records are available. Also, if you're looking for records that aren't necessarily available in every other genealogy library in the area, we do have several newspapers from St. Landry Parish. We have the Opelousas Courier, going back to the 1850s and continuing through most of the 19th century. That's very interesting. Some of the issues from the Civil War era are actually printed on the backside of newspaper. So besides seeing how, finding references to your ancestors in the newspaper, you can also flip the paper over and see what they might have decorated their houses with at that time. We also have the Clarion Progress and, of course, the Daily World, which is a 20th century publication, but we have all of those on microfilm. Finding your ancestors in the newspapers can be a difficult chore because, of course, most of them are not indexed anywhere, and so it's a matter of sitting down with the microfilm and scrolling through them, looking for references to the people that you're researching. Some of the other records that we have, the Sanborn insurance maps cover Opelousas and many smaller towns too. These are maps that were drawn for insurance purposes, so they are very detailed. They show each individual building, an outline of the structure, an indication of what the material they were constructed of, whether it's wood or cement or metal or whatever and what the roof type was, because of course that would influence what sort of insurance rates you would have to pay. These were done not every year, but they were often updated between the years when a new volume would be published. And it can give you a great amount of detail about where your ancestors lived. and what was located in that area. Not just the large cities were mapped, but often many smaller ones too. And so if there are maps for your hometown, it would give you a lot of information about the history, how the town grew, and how different locations were used at different points in time. And another collection that we have that is probably not used nearly as much as it should because it's not well known. We have a collection of St. Landry Parish records going back to 1803 or 1805, right after the Louisiana Purchase. We don't have the colonial records, but we do have the records after Louisiana became American territory. And these records include marriage records, divorce records, successions, so that you can find records on your ancestors there. Also, a number of other series that you wouldn't think of immediately as being sources of genealogical information, but they can be used that way. We have the records of the St. Landry Parish School Board in this series, and that goes up into the middle part of the 20th century. So there will be references in there to schools, their locations, who the teachers were, what the curriculum was, what the teachers were paid, and sometimes even a list of students, so that if you can find the records for the school in your area or where your ancestors lived, you might be able to find more about their education level, what sort of instruction they were given, and that sort of information. In the archives, we have a number of manuscript collections, and these are unique materials that are not available anywhere. Several from St. Landry Parish that would be of value to anyone researching the history of the area or possibly their family history. One of the most interesting collections are records of Emerson Bentley. Was a school teacher and a newspaper publisher in Opelousas right after the Civil War. This is the Reconstruction period when the freed slaves were developing they're trying to establish their place in the social order. So the newspapers, especially the ones published by the Republicans, were very interested in political power for African Americans, organizations, how they might establish their place in society on an equal footing with the whites who had previously been dominant. And most of it, this collection includes his diaries and scrapbooks that he kept during the time. And these records include newspaper clippings mostly from Opelousas, but also from other smaller papers, some of which don't even exist anymore, where he's talking about or saving articles that record daily happenings in the area as they related to race relations. There's a large series of clippings about the Opelousas race riots, where armed groups were in conflict over who should control the parish courthouse and the parish offices. So there's a lot of information there. Another set that we have are store ledgers from the Kahanan store in Opelousas, one volume from the late 1830s and another one from the late 1840s. At this time period, there wasn't a lot of cash in the world. Most people didn't pay for their purchases with cash, but they'd run up a tab at the store. The store would have these large ledgers, and there would be a page for each person or family. As you needed supplies during the course of the year, you would go in and purchase them, but you wouldn't pay for them until the fall, when your crops came in. You were able to sell the crop, and then you would go to the store and settle your accounts. And so these ledgers would record everything that you bought during the course of the year, whether it was a gallon of whiskey or a spool of thread or, a length of calico. There's all kinds of things. You can get a good idea of how your ancestors lived, what they needed that they weren't able to produce themselves, and also an indication perhaps of their financial status, because if they were able to charge a number of luxury items during the year, then they expected to make enough money off the crop to be able to pay that off at the end of the year. Whereas if they were just getting by, the sort of the materials they would buy would be the bare necessities. Coming up a little in the more recent history, we have a large collection from Ruth Robertson Bottineau, who was a historian who was active in St. Landry Parish and much of southwest Louisiana during the 1950s and 60s. One of her projects was to inventory historic sites in different parishes in the area, and St. Landry Parish was one of the parishes that she inventoried very extensively. She hunted out historic buildings and sites and recorded their history, a physical description of the site. If it was a house, she might record who lived there, who had lived there, who had built it, how it had been used over the decades or centuries since it was built. And the records for St. Landry Parish in this collection are very extensive and very well documented. There were also a large number of photographs in there. So that's another collection that is also worth delving into, especially if your family is connected to a historic site. And a historic site doesn't need to be, the big mansion along the river with thousands of acres attached to it. It might be something much more humble, even a store building or a sharecropper's cabin. If it has been there for 50 years or whatever the criteria for this survey, it would also be included in these collections. We have another similar collection from the Louisiana Historical Preservation and Cultural Commission, which was active in the 1930s or 1970s, and they had a similar project where they were surveying historic buildings all over the state, and particularly with the view of nominating them for listing on the National Historic Register. So these records are very extensive because the standards for the National Register are very strict, and so there are photographs of the buildings in the collection, also a physical description, lengthy histories of the buildings, what they were used for, who built them, a biography of the families that have lived in it, and again, many photographs and information on these different sites. And there are several buildings from the St. Landry Parish that are listed in this collection. So that's also worth looking at. Coming up into more recent times, if you're interested in researching race relations in St. Landry Parish, another collection to look at are the files of Richard Putnam, who was a federal court judge in Louisiana, mostly, during the 1960s and 70s. And he has handled mostly civil rights cases where groups were trying to, mostly integration cases in public schools. And at least one case I know of was dealing with St. Landry Parish. In these cases, the court files are very extensive and give you a very thorough overview of the people involved and the issues involved, the legal arguments that were used for both sides, and the grounds on which the judges would make their final decision. So that is a very brief overview of the different collections we have. And there are a number of other collections that might not necessarily specify St. Landry Parish, but which would have records of relevance to people doing research on families in St. Landry. One of them that is used very extensively is the Opelousas and Attakapaw District brand books. In the 19th and 18th century, as I mentioned before, there wasn't a lot of cash, and so one of the ways that people would establish themselves economically was through raising cattle. And St. Landry Parish especially was very, what's the word I want? There was a lot of cattle ranching in St. Landry Parish, especially out on the prairies. Anybody would let their cattle run loose on the prairies during the summer, and then they would have the roundup in the fall, just like you see in the Old West movies, but much earlier than that, even back into the 1700s. And because everybody's cattle ran together, there were no fences out on the prairies, and one brown cow looks very much like another brown cow. The way people would establish which cow was theirs was that they would brand them. And the brand books would record each person's mark to make sure that nobody was trying to use the same mark, and to make sure that the person who got the brown cow at the end of the year was the rightful owner. So these brands would be registered in the courthouse in Opelousas, or in the case of the Attakapaw District, in St. Martinville. We have these brand books going back into, oh golly, I know it's the 1700s, probably the 1730s even, when the first settlers established themselves in the area and when they started to raise cattle. And the brands would then be transferred to other members of the family a brand might start out as just a simple mark, maybe the first letter of the owner's last name, like an A, would be a simple brand to make. Then when he retired or died and his family took over, there might be more than one son, and so to differentiate between them, they might start with the same A, but they might add another initial to it, or they might add a number like 2 or 4 to the A, so that the same shape would be the basic brand, but then there would be something added to it to differentiate. And you can actually trace families this way by looking at similar brands and how they evolved over the course of several generations. The brand books go up into the 1900s, I think probably 1944 or so. And these are available. We've microfilmed them, and they are available for people to look at. And because the brands had to be registered, there will be a date on them, so you know when your ancestor first came to the area, because the first thing he would do would be to register his brand so that his cattle could run with the others and he could start increasing his herd. And then there would be a later date indicating when he either sold the brand or when it was transferred to another family member. So there's just an amazing number of collections that you can look at. Another one that we have are the records of the State Land Office. When the United States bought Louisiana, the first thing they tried to do was establish land title, because of course anytime there's a major transfer of land, there's always a few opportunists that are going to try and take advantage of the situation to acquire sizable pieces of property that perhaps they hadn't had title to before. Also, the United States government needed to establish who actually did own the land and confirm someone in a title that they might have been granted 30 years or more before. So the first thing they did was to come in and establish land offices in different parts of the country, and the Southwest District was headquartered in Opelousas. They sent out surveyors to establish the boundaries, and then they asked each landowner to prove his claim. And you could do that if you had a Spanish patent. That was wonderful. You could take that to the land office, and they would make a note of it, record the boundaries of your claim, and where you got the title, and then you would be given an American patent to the land. If you hadn't gone through all the steps to get the actual patent from the Spanish colonial officials, there were other ways you could prove your title too, because the government was not really interested in taking land away from people, only to establish a firm record of who owned what. So you might be able to bring a couple of neighbors with you who could swear that you have lived on this land for a length of time and have always farmed it, and that you acquired it in a grant from the French or colonial officials, but had not gone through all the steps needed to get the patent. So the claims then, there would be a file for each section of land, each claim. It would say who claimed the land, what its dimensions were, where it was located, usually who the neighbors on either side were, so that you could establish the boundaries. There would be a neat little map showing the land and any streams that might be running nearby, and the names of the adjacent property owners, and then how you were able to prove the patent, your claim, whether you had a patent or whether your neighbors testified that this was your land. So all of these records are in the state land office, but we have microfilm copies in the library. They are indexed. You can look up your ancestor's name and find out where their land was located, and then get a copy of the title that way. We don't have later land transfers because those records are in the courthouses, and it's a separate series of records, but we do have the original land claims when land was transferred from the Crown or from the Public Land Office to the original owner, or the owner of record as of 1805 or so. So that's another collection that you can use to trace your ancestors and find out where they lived, how much land they owned, and what they did there. So that's a very brief overview of some of the collections that we have in the archives. And of course there are also family histories, genealogy collections that might have records for your family. We're open to the public. We invite anyone to come in anytime that the Jefferson Caffrey Reading Room is open, and we will help you with your research. We can suggest collections to look at and resources that we might have that can help you with your family history.